Thank you very much for joining us. Today we have Vanessa. Welcome. Hello. Hi.
Hi.
How are you doing today?
Doing okay. It's a nice chilly day here in Mexico. We've got some rain and we're in the desert, so we don't get a lot of rain. It's
Okay.
been pretty nice.
Good. Yeah, I guess, we should kind of address the elephant in the room. This is my quickest turnaround for an episode where we're recording and then I'm immediately going to release it.
Yay!
Yeah. So today is the inauguration of our newest government and administration.
Woo! Finally!
Big day. A lot of things to celebrate, but there's also a lot of work to be done because let's remember 70 million people said that white supremacy and racism and hurtful and horrible things to other people was okay with them. And
Yeah.
we don't feel that way here.
No, not at all. I think it's very important to also realize that we probably know a lot of those people, especially as white people.
Yep.
So I know that some of my family is probably somewhere in that area of political thinking. I don't even know if you could really call it political thinking.
It's a lot of things, but today is a joyous day. Today is a celebration. We have our first female vice president. She is a woman of color. She is South Indian and Black. That is incredible. That is wonderful.
So awesome.
A lot of great things are happening. So it's a good day. And
cheers to that.
Yeah, we have a lot of work to be done and I'm excited about it. But we don't have to dwell on that. We can move away from that very quickly. But this was one of the things that I was thinking about because my two segments, one of them is called Wine About It, which we have talked about that, we can really whine about everything and anything,
It's easy.
But the other one is called Pass the Cheese. And we've met like very briefly, like our in-person relationship has been fairly minimal, but I mean, for the last year, it doesn't really matter who's having in-person relationships, right?
Right.
But knowing that this was happening with you and thinking about this coming up, something I've noticed about you, and again, I have to say, like, it's mostly over social media, but you're somebody that doesn't ever think that anything is too small or like worthy of being celebrated or worthy of being appreciated or worthy of being like respected. There's some people in this world who are like, oh, well, this thing isn't like really big or it's not going to get people to notice me, so like why do it? But you are not that kind of person, and that's really wonderful to see, and I appreciate that. Thank you.
Well, thank you. That's really sweet. Yeah. It's something that I've had to do a lot just because, especially being in Mexico for the past 4 years, like not a lot of big things have happened for us. And so like focusing on those smaller things has kind of helped me like stay positive about life, and just celebrating it for other people is like a natural extension of that. It's almost easier for me, I think, in a lot of ways to like celebrate other people versus myself. So kind of trying to bring that focus back in slightly has been something I've worked on, especially this year.
We've all worked on a whole lot of stuff, I think, and I hope. But that's really interesting that you say that, because like you think that moving to Mexico isn't a huge thing, or maybe it's living in Mexico, because I don't know, I guess like how many influencers do you like see of like, oh, I'm gonna move to Bali, or I'm gonna move to Mexico, or I'm gonna do this thing. And so it's really fascinating to hear that you don't think it's a big thing, because I don't know, I think it's huge.
I think, yeah, the move was huge. And I think maybe just being here so long now, it doesn't feel as big. Being isolated in our house makes it feel like not that huge. My boyfriend's parents lived in Japan for a few years in the 80s. And they would always say, when people ask them like, well, what's it like? It must be so like exciting and crazy. And they were like, to a certain extent, it's just doing your laundry in a different country.
Yeah.
Like,
Although it is funny. What was that?
It's very true. It often feels like that. It's just like, oh yeah, I'm just doing everything regular, going on my errands and just listening to a different language basically. And like, I'm not super good at Spanish, but I can get by.
It's funny though that you like that you know bring up like doing laundry because I've traveled some and I've been lucky enough in a couple of my trips that I've had longer time. So like the first time I ever left the country, I went on a month-long trip and we went to like 10 different countries. So it was really big kind of
Wow.
thing. And then I also lived in Istanbul for 3 months.
Oh,
Um,
awesome.
and so like something I've noticed when you do these things is everything is so much cooler in another country. Like gas stations are so much cooler, laundromats are so much cooler, and things that you would never do in your daily life, you're totally willing to do in
Oh,
another
yeah,
country.
definitely.
And something that I notice, like, especially when traveling, because a lot of times in another country, you're not renting a car. And, you know, not everybody, but most people have access to a car, you know, in the United States or in the life that they lead. And, you know, when you're traveling, you're like, oh, it'll take me an hour to walk to this place, and then I have to take 3 buses, and then it's another 45-minute walk. Yeah, sure, no problem, whatever. Like, let's do
Yeah.
it. And
Yeah, that's been something different for us since we drove down here from Minnesota. So
mm-hmm.
we had a car the entire time, but we did take a trip to a bigger city, Chihuahua City, which is the capital of Chihuahua State where we live. And that was so much fun. That was like right before the pandemic, maybe a couple months before. And it was just like amazing to get into a bigger city because we're in a pretty small town. I think that's another thing that makes it feel less exciting. It's a small town. You're living in a small town anywhere. There's a little bit less to do.
Mm-hmm.
But that was like an amazing time. We were just there for 3 days, but like walking places, discovering restaurants, and it was just awesome. And I wish we could do more of that, but gotta be responsible.
Well, let's talk very quickly about a place called Chihuahua City because I want to hear about this.
Yeah, it is the capital of Chihuahua State, and we live about 3 hours north of it. It's pretty much the main big city in Chihuahua, besides the one that's like the border town with El Paso up by Texas.
Mhm.
But it's like a very old city built back in like the 1700s, maybe even earlier. Lots of like gorgeous Spanish architecture. And we just stayed at a hotel in the city center, didn't really leave the touristy city center area, but it was so cool. They had art museums and a lot of like native, indigenous art in those museums, like really inclusive, and so many good restaurants. Oh my God. And they have this really long, fancy street where like back in back before the Mexican Revolution, there were a lot of like really wealthy people who were very like connected with the government, and the government would give these houses to the very wealthy people. But after the revolution happened, most of those houses were taken back and given to like the Equipo, or the community of people that live in the city.
Okay.
And most of those houses are hotels and restaurants. And one of them was a brewery that we went to. And it was like so cool.
Wow, that's great. It seems like that Mexico has kind of really like figured out maybe a better way of doing reparations.
I think they did. I think that in a lot of ways, the Mexican Revolution really like, I obviously am not an expert on it at all, but it just like, it seems like there's a lot more focus on bringing it back to the people of the country.
That's good. Yeah. You know, it makes me think, you know, in this time as a white person, I'm trying to do a lot more listening to things. And, you know, I know that a lot of my instincts is to like try and help or try and fix the situation. And so I'm having to fight a lot of stuff of like, nope, let's just sit back. Let's listen to what people are actually saying. And it's very interesting because I think a lot of people in excuse me, higher up or in bigger areas are not really doing that. And it just makes me think of like right now there's this one of the things that people white people are trying to do like in the government is or like at a government level, I should say, is do the, forgive me if I'm not saying it the right way, but the Negro prayer or the Negro national anthem. Um,
Hmm.
or maybe they're trying to, I'm doing this thing, well, I'll remember two things and I'll like kind of flip things about them.
I do that all the time.
'Cause I think that they've also talked about adding a prayer and also doing the Negro national anthem. And if that is not the appropriate verbiage for that, I apologize. I'm not trying to offend or be,
No, yeah.
um,
Yeah, I never know for sure how I personally feel about that word. Not that it matters how I personally feel about it, but just like I think it's hard to know if we hear other people say it and it's used in a specific context, it feels like, well, that is the name for this thing. Maybe it is okay to say. I
yeah,
think things are changing so quickly, especially with language and reclamation of words, that it can be really hard to know. But I think until you've been told, like, hey, don't,
right. Yeah.
how do you know?
Yeah, for that is a great point because for a very long time I assumed that using the verbiage black was not a positive way to describe somebody,
Me
because
too.
it
Yeah.
often, well, I don't even want to say that actually, but sometimes people use it to describe someone in a negative context. And so I
Hmm.
always thought that saying African American was a much more like respectful, like appreciative way to describe somebody. But
Same.
like a friend of mine pointed out, they're like, no, I am like, I don't identify as African American. I am black, like kind of thing with the capital B. And I was like, thank you for telling me because here I am.
Yeah.
I not talked to anybody about this. I just assumed, and I was like, oh, I'm being respectful and I'm being a nice person. Nope, I was just assuming. I didn't even bother to ask somebody.
Yeah. I think I don't know when I realized that, if I was explicitly told that or if I just kind of picked it up from social media. I mean, I think a lot of like my education in respect PC culture, even though that's like has its own negative connotations, I think that's really silly.
Mhm.
Like being politically correct in terms of not offending people on purpose is not a bad thing.
Yeah.
But it was sometime in college, I think. So like I remember in high school being very much like, oh yeah, saying like a black person must be racist. Like
Mhm.
that black person, I can't say that. That's a horrible thing to say. And then
Right.
being
Yeah.
told or reading like, no, that's so untrue.
Mhm.
So it's always like a learning process and an unlearning process,
Right.
especially.
Yes. Yeah. So I guess what we're trying to say is if you ever hear or see us using the wrong verbiage, please let us know because we want to use the right one. Um,
Yes.
yeah, it's a very, there's a lot happening.
Hmm. Hmm.
I just feel like I have to have this like beautiful, like profound statement, but sometimes you don't.
Yeah, sometimes it's just, it is what it is, and we're all trying our hardest.
Yeah.
And hopefully, people will have patience, and there's really no reason for anybody to have patience with white people, but
We are grateful for the people who do.
exactly.
Yeah, it is also really interesting because just kind of going back to, because I'm trying to think about like why or like how I've kind of come to these decisions. And I have this example of when like I was, 12 or 13 or whatever, and I saw the movie Clueless. And in the movie Clueless, Murphy describes the guy that Cher has a crush on in the beginning as a cake boy. And the way that it is said, it's said in a popular, like pop culture, in a movie that we all saw. It's not said necessarily as like any negative or positive thing. It's just like a description of somebody. And,
Hmm.
it also is kind of said, I feel like, in maybe a flippant way that's like, oh, it's a valley girl. It's just like a kind of like a thing that can describe somebody. And so, I was young. I used this around a, uh, a a friend or a sister's, my older sister's friend, and she was like, "Oh, we don't say that. That's a harmful term for somebody who's gay." And I was like, "Oh, thank you very much. I had no idea."
Yeah, especially at that age.
Yeah. Maybe also I'm like categorizing it as like a much nicer response than I actually was at 12 because, all 12-year-olds, you know. But, it's just something that I reflect on also is this was a term that was made okay by popular culture, at least made okay to me. And
Mhm.
like it is said in a way that's very casual. It doesn't necessarily have any like negative connotations about it, but it's just kind of like thrown away and kind of just said that this is a thing that we can say about people.
Yeah.
And so it was just like it's very interesting to sit with that and kind of figure out
Yeah.
where it's
Yeah.
coming from.
In middle school, I remember like the R word specifically was everybody said that about everything.
Yeah.
And like looking back on that, like, oh my gosh, how hurtful. And
Mhm.
but at the same time, it was in popular culture and all of my friends said it, and I just had no idea, and nobody had ever said anything. And when I got older, and maybe because the opinions in society kind of changed about it too,
Mhm.
I was like, I can't believe I used to say that. That is so horrible.
Right. Yeah, I guess what we're saying is the people who do stand up and to educate people, we appreciate that. Thank you for
Very much.
yeah.
Yeah. I try to always like assume that even if it makes a person angry when I correct them or like, hey, that's actually not an okay thing to say anymore. Here's why.
Mhm.
Here's who it hurts. Like, even if they react negatively to it in the moment, like assuming that maybe in 10 years they'll be like, oh my God, I can't believe I used to say that. Like, thank God somebody told me.
Yeah, I appreciate that I've had people along this journey and along this path that have been able to like correct or redirect or point out certain things to me.
Yeah.
I've had a safe space of people who have been able to do that. And so that's
Yeah.
something that I'm also trying really hard to remind myself of. Not everyone is as far along in this as I. And I'm not going to say that I'm at the end of this if there is
Right.
an end. Like,
I think as soon as you think you're at the end of it, you've almost gone back to the beginning. Like, no, it's always going to be a working relationship.
and maybe also if like you're at the end of one thing, you're at the very beginning of another thing.
Exactly, exactly.
Well, we are kind of like at the end of it. Is there anything that you want to say or any one thing you want to bring awareness to or
Um,
it's okay. You don't
Unfortunately, no, I know that's not very interesting, but just thank you so much for having me on. This has been really fun. Been
yeah, thanks for
snacking on
coming.
my cheese the whole time. It was like a cheese and wine podcast where it's not the main focus. I can just sit there and eat. That sounds perfect.
Yeah, nobody's sponsoring me, so I'm not gonna give any sponsorships or anything. I'm not gonna
No,
advertise.
I have unnamed wine, unnamed
Mm.
cheese.
Yes. Well, thank you very much, Vanessa. We really appreciate your time today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's been
Yeah,
great.
of course. Thanks for everything you shared with us, everything you taught us, all that. We appreciate it.
Yeah.